Stories about EMTs. What's the scariest situation you've seen when you came on call? Story 1. Fire ruins. The night incident. On that ominous night, the highway winding through the wooded hills was plunged into absolute silence. Only the rare headlights of passing cars interrupted the gloom. But at this time, when the night was at its darkest and calmest, two young couples riding Mustangs decided to add their adrenaline boost to this tranquility. They weren't planning on just cruising down the highway. They were determined to test the limits of their machines. With the loud roar of engines and the shrieking of tires, their Mustangs began to rush down the road at an astonishing speed. It seemed as if the night had already become part of their competition, and only speed mattered. Only a few minutes passed when one of the cars in the right lane suddenly lost control. Trying to cope with the erratic steering, the driver slid and spun on the road, crashing into a guardrail. This collision with the guardrail sent the car into a ditch, where it rolled over and came to a stop. The driver miraculously survived, but his condition was critical when paramedics arrived. He was evacuated from the scene, leaving behind a wrecked, mangled car. Meanwhile, another car in the left lane suffered an even worse fate. At full speed, it flipped over the guardrail and ended up in the oncoming lane. As a result of this tragic maneuver, the Mustang crashed into a Jeep that was traveling in the opposite direction. The collision happened head-on with devastating force, and immediately afterward, the Mustang's vehicle caught fire. When firefighters and rescue workers arrived on the scene, they saw an eerie sight. The fire that broke out after the collision had completely destroyed the Mustang. The fire had consumed what was left of the car, turning it into a charred mess. The remaining wreckage was so mangled that it became impossible to determine who was in the car. The faces and features of the Mustang's occupants had completely disappeared. Their bodies turned to charcoal, and only charred pieces remained. But the horror did not end there. The driver of the Jeep also found himself in a tragic situation. After the collision, his body was torn apart. His torso had been thrown out of the steering wheel side window and was hanging on the side of the road. The driver's leg still had a firm grip on the pedals, but his internal organs were scattered across the seat. The fatal crash had left a trail of incredible destruction and pain at the scene. Rescuers, working in silence, interrupted only by the sounds of their actions and the crunching of charred remains of cars, carefully collected the remaining body parts and the remains of cars. Every moment of their work emphasized the tragedy that had occurred that night. These macabre images left an indelible mark on the memory of those who saw them. Story 2. A trauma that makes your blood run cold. Ethan has always dreamed of becoming a paramedic and saving lives, but so far his dream was only on the way to being realized. In high school, to get the experience he needed, he volunteered as a paramedic ambulance attendant. Although he had only recently started his duties, he was determined and enthusiastic. However, none of the training materials and theoretical knowledge could have prepared him for what he had to witness that night. One night, as the moon was sliding across the heavens and the city was sinking into the tranquility of the night, an emergency call came in. Dispatch reported an emergency where a guy was seriously injured after being struck by a horse. This case was not like all the previous ones and required immediate intervention. When Ethan and his partner arrived on the scene, they saw that the situation was really critical. The guy, who was in his early 20s, was lying on the ground surrounded by people who were trying to give him first aid until the ambulance arrived. The horse apparently became frightened and struck the guy in the face with its hoof. The injury was so severe that most of his face was virtually destroyed. It was a gruesome sight that would be hard to forget. Despite the gruesome condition, the guy showed incredible courage. He tried to make jokes to ease the tension of the situation. Breathing with difficulty and with an expression of pain on his face, he tried to keep up a conversation to distract himself and others from the horrifying sight. Ethan, who had only recently started his career, found it hard to contain his fear and awe at the gruesome incident. The relief work was difficult and stressful. Ethan and his partner acted quickly and clearly, trying to stabilize the patient's condition and minimize damage until more qualified paramedics arrived. Their every move was under strict control, and every mistake could have serious consequences. An ambulance crew soon arrived on the scene, and professionals took over the patient's treatment. Story 3: Under Shards and Fear. That evening, as the night's tranquility was disturbed by the neon lights of city signs and the noise of passing cars, police officer Simon received a call that changed his perception of his job. The call came into the dispatch station, and, as usual, he immediately went to the scene. When Simon arrived at the gravel parking lot, he knew immediately that he had encountered something terrible. The Jeep, which for some reason had been at the epicenter of this accident, was upside down, and at first glance looked like a wrecked structure that had suffered a serious accident. The gravel strewn around and broken car parts testified to the magnitude of the accident. The story of this tragic event began when a man with a passion for drifting, who decided to show off his skills in a gravel parking lot, found himself in a difficult situation. He was driving around the lot, accelerating the Jeep, and demonstrating his driving skills. But when he hit a bump, the worst happened. The Jeep lost stability and flipped over. The sudden movement and impact with the ground resulted in no control of the vehicle. At the time of the accident, the man and his young son were not wearing seatbelts. This proved to be a fatal mistake. The fall and rollover of the vehicle was so severe that the Jeep came to a stop and both passengers were in a terrible position. The child was wedged under the center pillar, his legs stuck, preventing him from moving. His situation was extremely painful, but far worse was the plight of his father. The father, who was driving at the time, ended up under the dashboard. The impact was so powerful that the man's head was crushed. He was dead on the spot, and his condition left no doubt that there was no help for him. The father's body and his chair were a mess, propped up by car parts and mangled by the aftermath of the accident. The child remained next to his father's body for at least 20 minutes in this horrific position. During this time, emergency services arrived on the scene to help the child and record all the details of the incident. Simon and his co-workers worked to gently release the boy without causing additional pain. When Simon finally freed the boy and began administering first aid, the little boy, still in shock, asked about his father. The question he asked was full of pain and bewilderment. He wanted to know if his daddy was still alive. Story 4: When Relaxation Turns to Tragedy. The world of Thomas, a young and energetic man, changed the day his father, who works as a firefighter, told him about an event that shook him to the core. Thomas has always been proud of his father, who worked as part of an emergency response unit. These men and women don't just put out fires, they also assist in the most horrific accidents where their skills and courage become crucial to saving lives. One day, when Thomas was just beginning to realize how difficult his father's job could be, his father came home after a long and grueling day on duty. He told a story that left a mark on Thomas's mind and made him reconsider his own habits on the road. That afternoon, the fire department received a call to the scene of a serious automobile accident. It was a typical head-on crash, but with one critical difference. The injured woman was sitting in the car in an unusually uncomfortable position. She was relaxed, resting her feet on the dashboard. This was her habit on long trips. She thought she was more comfortable that way. At the moment of the accident, however, that position had proved fatal. The frontal collision occurred with such force that all the energy of the impact was concentrated on the front of the car. Because the woman's legs were positioned on the dashboard, they became pinned against her head as a result of the sharp impact. This created an unimaginable degree of injury and destruction. Firefighters arrived on the scene and began working to extract the victim. The situation was critical. The woman, despite her good health prior to the accident, was in terrible condition. Both of her legs were broken at the hips, and it was obvious that she needed urgent medical attention. The emergency crew, including Thomas's father, acted with the utmost care so as not to cause any more damage. The job of removing the victim from the car was difficult and delicate. It required cutting out part of the car's structure to free her without aggravating her injuries. The process was complex and required precision to preserve as many vital structures as possible and minimize further damage. Once the woman was extracted and placed in the ambulance, she was rushed to the hospital. Surgeons began surgery, which was extremely complex and required a highly skilled approach. Because of the severe fractures and potential soft tissue damage, she needed rapid intervention to recover. Story 5. Bathroom Nightmare. It was an ordinary evening in Martin's apartment. The small room, dimly lit, filled with cozy details, seemed to be a peaceful and safe place. Martin, like many people, used this part of the day to relax after a hard day's work. He decided to take a bath and freshen up, enjoying a moment of solitude. But what seemed like a routine procedure soon turned into a nightmarish experience. It all started when Martin tripped on the wet floor and lost his balance. As he fell precariously, he bumped into a toilet paper holder mounted on the wall. This element of the bathroom seemed to be completely ordinary, but at that moment was the source of the horrific injury. The toilet paper holder was made of a strong metal pin which, upon direct impact, entered Martin's eye. The piercing blow was so strong that the pin not only pierced the eye, but also penetrated the back of the skull. Martin felt unbearable pain as the pin made its way through the eye socket and deeply penetrated the skull. Every movement he tried to make caused the sensation of metal scraping against the inside walls of his skull. The sounds he heard were like a piercing creak and crackle, as if something was scratching from inside his head. This added to the terror and sense of helplessness as Martin did not know how to proceed or what to do next. The situation was critical. Visually, one could see that the pin was coming out of his head, sticking unnaturally out of his eye socket, and blood was slowly dripping down his face. This gruesome scene was shocking enough to cause panic. Maddened by fear and pain, Martin tried to restrain his movements so as not to make the situation worse. When Martin finally pulled himself together and was able to seek help, his condition was already extremely serious. Upon arriving at the hospital, he was immediately placed in the operating room. The surgeons faced the daunting task of carefully removing the pin and preventing further damage to vital structures. Every move the surgeons made was carefully calculated to minimize risk and ensure the best possible recovery. The extraction process was complex and required a high degree of skill to avoid unintended consequences and injuries. Story 6. Under the Wheels. Jonathan's world working in the emergency services was saturated with hard and often shocking stories. These stories were part of his daily work, but even for him, there was a certain line he didn't want to cross. At times, he felt it was best to keep his worst experiences to himself. One day, however, he recounted an incident that struck him to the core and left an indelible mark on his memory. The incident occurred late at night when Jonathan and his team were called to the scene of a tragic accident. The incident in question turned out to be one of the darkest and most tragic of his career. It all started with a trivial argument between a couple that broke out in a parking lot near their home. The girl and her boyfriend got into an argument, and in the midst of an emotional outburst, the girl decided to drive off in her car without waiting for the guy to move away to safety. Unfortunately, the boyfriend was at risk. As the girl sped away, he got stuck underneath the car. The situation was critical, and the consequences didn't last long. The car began to move, and the guy found himself trapped under it. The gravel path on which they were moving turned out to be covered with debris and inequalities, which only aggravated the situation. As soon as the car started moving, the boy was under the wheels, and his body was subjected to continuous pressure and friction. The wheels rolled inexorably along the road, rubbing his body, turning it into a bloody trail. Each meter of travel increased the magnitude of the tragedy, creating a depressing picture that would be hard to imagine in the most gruesome nightmares. When emergency services arrived on the scene, they found a horrific trail stretching for almost 3 kilometers. The picture was shocking. The car had left behind a bloody path strewn with debris and traces of fear. Under the wheels of the car, instead of a whole body, there was only a blood-red mixture that left no indication that there had once been a human being there. Jonathan, as well as his colleagues, was shocked by what he saw. Even for a seasoned emergency services professional, the scene was unimaginable. A depressed mood and a sense of deep sadness filled him after he saw what was left of the guy. Shocked by the magnitude of the tragedy, Jonathan couldn't escape the thought of how quickly something so terrible could happen. Story 7. An unexpected twist. On an ordinary evening on the outskirts of a small town, An event occurred that would later become the subject of discussion and horror for many. In this town lived a young guy named Henry, who was known for his frequent and raucous parties. He was a well-known face in the local clubs and often spent time with friends in his auto. One night, he decided to spend the evening with a girl named Kelly. They spent time at the party, and later, as the night came to an end, they decided to go home. After they had a few drinks and relaxed, Kelly got behind the wheel and Henry took the passenger seat. A conversation ensued between them, and despite his not-so-good mood, Kelly suggested they make a short drive to see the city at night. They headed to an old parking lot near the edge of town that had been used as a test drive and freestyle venue in the past. The parking lot was covered in dusty gravel, and the markings of the spots had long since been erased, but Kelly and Henry paid no attention to it. In complete relaxation, they began to paddle the car around, performing sharp maneuvers and occasionally exceeding the speed limit. During one of these maneuvers, Kelly misjudged the distance and hit a large rock, which was hidden under a layer of dust. The violent impact caused her to lose control of the car. The car, having gained speed, threw itself sharply to the side as Kelly attempted to correct the situation. This maneuver caused the car to flip over, and ending up on its roof, came to a difficult stop with its front end stuck in a deep hole, leaving the rear end on the edge of the pass. Henry, seated in the back seat, found himself trapped under the overturned car. Although his body was partially protected by the back seat, the rest of him was under the wheels. Kelly, after getting out of the car, panicked and tried to find a way to help Henry, but was paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do. Time passed, and while passers-by began to gather around the scene, Henry remained trapped under the car. Every movement of the car and attempt to trip over the rocks only added to his distress. The sounds that came from under the car were horrible and unbearable, scraping of metal and thuds. The emergency services that arrived on the scene soon realized that the task of extracting the victim would be extremely difficult. The rescuers worked tirelessly, using special equipment to lift the vehicle and free Henry. When they were finally able to pull him out, the scene was horrific. Henry was severely injured and his condition was critical. Nevertheless, the emergency services team did their best to get him to hospital.